Hi there, it's Polly here with Mr. Snoots. And behind me is the magnificent chaos of the, what's that? The Bixima to Idapur section of my skirt collection. Anyway, tea talks. We have not done one for quite some time. And so, produces tea as definite. This is Russian Caravan, one of my favourites. It is a smoky tea. Unlike that San Sujong, which is, I find, way too smoky. Russian Caravan is ace. Anyway, he drinks it all the time. I just wanted to look at some game design processes that I've been going through. So, a viewer here spoke to me about the fact that they have a love-hate relationship with Ancient Miniatures Wargaming. For many of us, it was like a gateway into miniatures gaming, and from miniatures gaming into role-playing gaming. So, viewed with much nostalgia and fondness, but a source of much heartache and dismay, because the rules, as my viewer put it, tend to break down into either A, the Romans win, or B, the best rules lawyer wins. Ancients rules uniquely seem to attract rules writing styles that use lawyerly language, lots of ipso factos and if-thens, which make it very hard to comb through the statements and figure out what's going on. They are weirdly impenetrable, and as such they're not very accessible, particularly for new players, younger players, or people who want fun. But a thing that I personally have noticed is that systems that have come out at the moment, they tend to be either incredibly abstracted. So there's a couple of rule sets that have been quite popular, but in breaking troops down to pretty much just genera, so this unit is a generic melee unit, or just saying that something is blade, which is supposed to represent everything from like Saxon Huskarls to Roman legionaries, the flavour that is so unique to the fighting styles and the way these troops operated disappears. So I just sat down to have a think about how to essentially create something new that handles these. So, with the assistance of Mr. Snoots, we've actually cooked up some rules which I'm trying to get a publisher to pay attention to at the moment. But first principles, what are we attempting to simulate here? Well, let's say we're trying to simulate combat in the ancient era, which we will define from, let's say, reaching from ancient Sumer to Dark Ages. Let's get the Byzantines in there by all means. We could extend this to cover the Middle Ages, but let's just say for now we're going to go for High Ancients period. So we want to be able to cover Macedonians and Romans and these kind of eras, and the concurrent empires in China, etc. So we have to be able to create a game that simulates what's actually going on the battlefield. It must not be so in-depth that it bogs us down in detail and slows play. Play has to be nuanced enough to be interesting, but not so complicated that it becomes almost like a second job to become in any way conversant with the rules. I personally want something that can be done with miniatures and can be done, if you want, cheaply with miniatures. So it can be done in 6mm, because I've seen a lot of 28mm armies at the moment that are $8,000 or $9,000 a piece. So it's taken Ancients out of the reach of ordinary everyday gamers. And one of my favourite Napoleonics rules was Napoleon's Battles, and it came with counters. You could just play it with the counters in the box. And obviously you could go out and get 15mm troops and play it with that if you wished, but you could play it with the counters. So we want that flexibility. So here's what I came up with. So as far as troops operating, the first thing is missile power. Missile power is not there to essentially kill people off per se. If you have a look at what was actually happening, and yes, I am someone that actually reads ancient drill books. I have a staggering collection here. You'll find things like the appearance of skirmishes, say, particularly if you go through like Greek warfare, where you have the phalanxes dominating, locked shields, dense infantry formations, very difficult to deal with except by somehow superior infantry formations, but it is very much a deadlock. Skirmishes, largely guys with javelins or slingers, or quite famously in the case of Cretans, archers, begin to have some success. They're not having success at wiping out lines of phalangites, but what they are doing is they are sowing disruption in the line and confusing these units so that they then become vulnerable to a melee attack. Passing of orders is difficult. Troops begin to hesitate. The line becomes ragged as people stop and protect themselves with their shields, as the occasional casualty rattles the line. When you start getting to things like Romans against, say, Parthian horse archers, again, it's not like a Western. They're not being surrounded by Apaches and somehow showered with arrows until they drop dead to a man. What is happening is that their units are being thrown into such confusion and they become stationary. They no longer maneuver because they are under so much pressure that essentially the unit ceases to advance. We need this coming through. And of course, sure, perhaps eventually you could wear someone down with missiles, but that eventually has to be a factor. So let's say units have two essential abilities. One is the ability to disrupt someone from a distance. That could be from skirmishes, skirmishing with a line. That could be done as massed archers, say like in classical Indian armies, where they are firing massed volleys. That's going to have a longer range and a certain effect. Elephants. Woohoo! Elephants famously disrupted enemy cavalry lines simply by being elephants. Horses were terrified of them. So, without landing a physical blow, you have the ability to disrupt and halt and sow confusion in the ranks. So that's going to be disruption. Now then, we come to closer contact. But here's the thing that you have to look between the lines in so many different tactical manuals. But if you read Tacitus, Germania, and so on, you begin to see infantry lines contacting each other in melee is much rarer than you think. Much like bayonet fights in, say, Napoleonics, people do not like going hand-to-hand and fighting mano a mano until, everyone lies dead, or, the one triumphant barbarian poses on top of a mound of corpses. Very often, lines are breaking. If you read things like Tacitus, it starts talking about the war cries of the Germans and how they halt and they begin to give this thing called the baratus, a low, deep, throaty howl, like throat sing, which goes behind their shields to echo, and they ripple the shields up and down the line to make this ghastly, terrifying sound. It can rattle the other side, so when the Germans advance, the other side can break. But also, it stirs up the Germans. It basically increases their morale because they're not 100% sold on spending today with only a 50% chance of surviving. So very often these late Roman contacts, they are not where two units smack into each other. Germans and legionaries approach and both try and essentially fire themselves up so that they might be the ones who charge home, but it might not happen. If one line comes on, the other line can break. Not always. But so obviously psychological presence is a huge thing. We come again to elephants. Mano a mano, they are kind of brutal to take. But, dense pike blocks and agile groups of infantry and so on can take them on. But their physical presence is terrifying. So they have an ability to exert pressure on an enemy line, even without coming, nose to snout in contact. Same goes for things like pikes. The advance of pikes is very dreadful to behold. It is a solid wall and it is relentless. Troops will actually fall back before pikes rather than engage. Roman legionaries could actually do the same. So let's say that there is another factor we're going to call pressure. This is that close range pressure as groups are within in close engagement range. And that both represents their physical fighting prowess, but it also represents psychological factors that make them overall the enemy. The reputation of a group as particularly fierce fighters, the fact that they're a honking great elephant. So I would say, for instance, let's say Roman, if we were to give things values, which I have worked on and attached, let us say that Roman legionary swordsmen, who are pretty damn coherent, let's give them a factor of 5. Let's say something like Greek phalangites that are all locked tight together. They actually present a pretty fearsome spectacle. Let's give them a pressure of 6. Let's say something like loose order Gallic tribesmen and so on. They're probably going to be a 4. They exert less pressure in a nose-to-nose melee than Roman legionaries. So you begin to build units on the pressure that they exert closely and the disruption that they can produce at range. But we want all those little things that make this such a colourful period. So let us not forget those. Let's put those in as traits. These are things that add or modify the basic rules of engagement we're cooking up. So things like very deep formations, like some of the Theban hoplites, and like pike formations. That should be a thing. Byzantine cavalry often did the same. They'd form up 10 deep. You get a unit that is less manoeuvrable, but is quite good at absorbing damage. Flexible formations, like Roman Republican legionary manipular formation, where they are in their checkerboard blocks with the tritari at the back to fall back on if these very flexible units who keep engaging, re-engaging and passing through each other. It's a very flexible form of fighting. Late Roman legions, who often have light infantry units built into the actual unit structure, who are there to do spoiling attacks, attack on flanks, pelt the enemy, pursue the enemy. These give you flexible abilities. In many ways, they can sort of absorb the damage, perhaps by trading in movement for damage once or twice. You can get impact units that are particularly fearsome when they move into contact. Things like that wild charge of Gallic tribesmen, things like Lancer or Kontos armed cavalry charging in, these kind of things. So they give you a bonus to your pressure if you are charging into contact. Possibly only once, because something like a Roman Legion unit, that is going to be an impact unit. Pillar get used up, men get tired, horses get tired, horses get blown. Just ask Donald Trump. So you start to come up with this list of things that make units distinct from one another. Are they trained in using long spears defensively in cavalry? Are they pikemen? Are they using heavy two-handed cutting weapons that defeat armour? Are they armoured? Are they highly disciplined? Are they skirmishers? Are they cavalry? Are they armoured cavalry? Are they cataphract cavalry? Are they archers, relying on that massed firepower? So you get a system now where you can define units by those two numerical stats and by their traits. So, for instance, what I cooked up with was, let us say, early Imperial Roman legionaries. Right, they have no disruption ability. They have a pressure of 5. They are impact troops. They have the pillar and they are trained to aggressively move into the attack. So if they can do that, they get a bonus. They are disciplined. Don't have to be. Some of the Eastern legions kind of got drunk and rowdy and kind of lost that, but in general, disciplined, which gives them the ability in many ways to shrug off damage, and armoured. So they are, in fact, slightly less vulnerable to skirmisher tactics than some other troops would be, and this obviously gives them an advantage in melee. Something like those wild Britons, British tribesmen, they're going to have a pressure of 4, they do not have a disruption ability, they are impact troops. We're going to attach points values to all of these, so those Gallic tribesmen are going to end up as far cheaper troops than the Romans, but there's going to be more of them on the ground. So you can see how you can begin to build distinctive units that will have their distinctive flavours in the game. Things like light infantry and so on, you can deploy them as skirmishers, or in the case of some armies, you could split those units up, let's say, and attach them to others to give a disruption ability to units that would not otherwise have it, or strengthen their disruption ability. German cavalry were famous for bringing light infantry along with them, basically holding onto the bridles and running beside the horses, half running, half dragged. But when the units got into action, these would form like a skirmish line in front of their horses, delivering shots, and then in the melee they're helping out. So you can do that. Other armies, you can sometimes attach skirmishing groups. So for instance, those ancient Britons, there were adolescent sort of javelin armed skirmishers and so on that would come along, and you could certainly get instances where they are attached to war bands. They essentially come bursting out through the ranks and shower javelins and run like hell. These are teenagers, they're not expected to stand up, but they are still part of the formation. You could argue that light chariots could be added to a British formation much the same way, because they are rumbling out from behind the protection of the infantry and making missile runs on the enemy and then coming back, or holding back to do skirmish attacks. Or you might even argue that this could give that British unit a flexible formation if it is designed to do things like use some chariots attached to it to do spoiling attacks, to do missile runs, to do flank attacks during a combat. So you can build things that are subtler than they seem. So anyway, this is what I've cooked up. I've just called these things pike and pilum just for the hell of it. The other thing you need is going to be an initiative system, a play system that brings gamesmanship into it. Now, a lot of older games were always done I go, you go. It gives you a game, but the main problem is there's not much sort of to and fro, and someone who's very good at niggling with and interfering with the rules can cleverly measure things so that they're just out of range. And if you get something like impact troops, which are only any good if they move into contact, these guys can always make sure they're 1 millimeter out of contact, etc. So, a more dynamic and interactive system there. So what I've come up with is something using cards. Now, you don't want something that's too silly, but you do want some risk and reward. That's what makes the game the game. Risk, reward. And also using some sort of, in-game currency. So, what me and me learned friend decided to come up with, straightens boob, let's use the cards. Let's say both sides turn over a card, and whoever has the highest card is the winner of the initiative phase initially. Both sides then will draw one card face down for each unit they possess, but 2 cards for each leader that they possess. You can also use leaders in combat to give you a bonus, but here's one of their main uses. Then, whoever has the initiative, you take the top 2 cards and you turn them over and you put them beside your face-down deck. So everyone will have a left-hand face-up card, a right-hand face-up card, and a draw deck. When you move, you'll move with your left-hand face-up card. you'll nominate a unit and you're going to move it on that card value. If your opponent wants to challenge the move, they have to take a card from their pickup deck, declare that they're doing a challenge, and turn that card over. If the card that they have turned over is of greater value than the one that you're attempting to move the unit on, then that card that the unit was trying to move on is discarded. The card that the challenger drew from their pickup deck is discarded. The challenger now has the initiative, and they're going to move on their leftmost card. The other guy basically now takes a card from his pickup deck, puts it into what was the right-hand slot, and turns it over. So you've always got two face-up cards moving through. You can always see what's coming. But you can take the chance and try and usurp someone's move and move instead. Now, the presence of your leaders gives you some leeway. You're going to have some extra cards to mess with. But if you get stuck into this, eventually you may end up having to sacrifice moving some of your troops in order to focus your attention and be able to move in areas that particularly matter to you on the battlefield. I put a thing in so you can double down. So if you don't like the card you drew, you can draw another one. So you might waste 2 or 3 or 4 cards trying to beat someone's card. And they can do the same to try and fight you back, drawing from their pickup deck to replace the card they're fighting. So you could actually drain a lot of resources if you become hyper-fixated. But it gives you some risk reward, it gives you some game currency to work with. It also does mean that loss of leaders means loss of flexibility in a real sense, so that you are not able to interfere with the other guy's plans in the way you used to. You need a clear way of ending a battle. Now, things like DBM and so on, you got into quite a often complex system where you're trying to figure out how many different units you've got, and you have to figure out, once you've lost a proportion of those units, you lose. However, diddly-dum, diddly-dee, daddle-dum. So what we've done in these is said, all right, let us say you have victory counters. Each side's got basically army morale counters. That army will get 1 army morale counter for every 2 units that it has. Every time you lose a unit or a leader, you lose 1 army morale counter. So in general, you can keep going until about half of your troops are en route, or half your troops and leaders. So, but every time you lose one of these, you remove one of your victory counters and chuck it away. When you've run out of army morale, that's it. Game over, pal. So there's a very easy visual reminder for yourself as to who's winning and losing. I think is probably the best way of keeping track, rather than asking people to do maths and perhaps rather dubiously. We'd get this in DBM games. Suddenly you look at the board and say, I think I beat you 2 turns ago, by the way, pal. Oh, yeah, I'll just recalculate it. It also means you can do things like, say, if you've got a Sassanid army, you've got pretty expensive mainline cavalry, so you might not have that many units, which means you might be vulnerable to morale if you lose a few of those. So you can buy crap units. They had kind of levy spearsmen and so on. You might do that to kind of build up the army morale. If you can get those so that these guys are total crap but cost you very little, you can use that kind of as like a morale building back line. They're mostly there as cheerleaders for the main guys. You can do tactics like that. So anyway, these were the things I was thinking of as I was sitting down designing, looking at the problems. It has to be simulationist enough to give you the flavour of the period and give you tactics that will work given the tools these guys had and how they use them. It has to do that without bogging you down in detail. The combat system has to be ready and easily absorbed, and it should be as argument-free as possible. So, the general idea would be you'll be going through that initiative system. As units approach, you do disruption tests where people's skirmish lines can attempt to essentially open fire on units in front of them. People's skirmishers can counter one another, so there is a battle of the skirmish lines. Successful use of skirmishers essentially puts disruption onto units, which stops them moving unless they can do morale rolls to come forward. If you keep heaping damage onto someone that's already disrupted, it becomes real damage. We'll say that each of these units has different fighting states. We'll say that the units can become like shaken, or they can become reeling. They've either taken casualties or they've taken a ton of casualties, and the next phases they just break. So, keep the number of counters on the board at a minimum. So there's no actual physical, real written bookkeeping, apart from designing your units, obviously. But at best, you'll have like a counter on something saying that it's disrupted, and you'll have something saying it's either shaken or reeling. Simple. So, the disruption phase. People who want to move who are disrupted have to start doing morale checks to do so. Units begin coming into contact. Things like big pike blocks are going to be grinding forward. Groups like Roman Republican legionaries who are fighting those pike blocks, they might start trying to move their troops in ways that make use of their mobility to try and spoil the ability of those pikes to do so much damage to the front. They're looking to attack the flanks, or they're looking to attack and fall back and draw out, or they're looking to use light infantry to try and stagger the line a bit. Roman cavalry ally are going to be coming in and doing disruption attacks, showering javelins, trying to basically disrupt the enemy, soften them up for a blow. You're going to have horse archers skirmishing away. Horse archers obviously have a great disruption but a poor presence. Javelin-armed skirmishing cavalry have, a fair presence and, a fair disruption ability, but the guys with javelins and shields are what you send in to counter the horse archers, exactly the way the drill books tell you to. So you end up with a game that functions the way an ancient battle seems to have functioned. You're not obsessively having to make lists of these guys have got a javelin and a light shield, they're A-grade morale, and, or remember to bring their sandals today. It's not broken down into abstractions like DBM, where this is a blade, this is a cavalry, so that, samurai cavalry are exactly the same as Roman cavalry, are pretty much the same as medieval Persian cavalry. These will all have their different fighting styles, which will come through. So, this was how, to my designer's eye, the problems should be solved. I'm going to try and get this published, but I just thought I'd walk you through the kind of thoughts that were going through my mind as I tried to crack the problem that a viewer brought up about how to make a set of Ancients rules that aren't going to drive you mad, but that are going to have some fun, engage your interest in the period again, and just get you playing. So anyway, that was our tea talk, and I'm sorry I haven't done many of these. Someone said they were missing the extra games content I did. Yeah, the transgender community has been in a lot of trouble over in the United States. It was just destroying me not being able to help. I have to do whatever I can. I can't reach out to the USA and the UK and do much except to try and buoy up morale, and I am advising some different groups on how to fight. Here in Australia, I'm a major activist. I talk to attorney generals, I talk to members of parliament, I talk to the Minister of Human Rights. I do what I can in the areas I can reach out to, but preserving transgender history was very important for our community because it's physically being destroyed. And as a historian, I actually found it fascinating. This was a whole new project for me. There is a whole history there that's been hidden. It's been quite interesting to bring out. And we tend to wrongly look on history as being clashes of mighty empires and, who killed who. But history's made up from historical actors. History's made up from people. History's the story of people in society. So digging out some of these people and digging out some of these sort of transgender communities and so forth, back in Akkadian times and back in medieval times and back in Roman times, etc., has been a huge challenge. It's been an exciting project. So, I needed to do that, and I will still be doing that. But yes, I will make sure I get more little things on design like this. And there are some other just little aspects of games publishing at the moment that we probably need to look at. So anyway, look, much love to everyone out there. I truly hope we can all meet around a games table somewhere, somewhen. I would love that. I would adore that. So would he. So from what basically looks like a bazaar somewhere in Arabia, as witnessed by, God, I own so much silk. Look at that. Oh my God. Anyway, I will see you guys somewhere, somewhen. Look after yourselves and keep gaming. Bye.